evening, everybody. Welcome back to the Mythgard Academy. This is session number 8 of Till We Have Faces, as tonight we get to the enactment of Orual's grim resolution that she comes to. But first, we have to finish watching her come to her conclusion. But first, before we do that, a couple announcements. First of all, we have on the Moot front, which is always fun to talk about. We just had Mountain Moot. Lovely to see folks. Got to talk with Sarah over lunch, which was great, and to see a whole bunch of people. It's our that was our second Mountain Moot out in Denver, and just a wonderful time. We then are getting ready now for our last fall season Moot, our last Moot of calendar year 2023, and that is Bayou Moot down in New Orleans. This is our first trip ever down there to New Orleans, so looking forward to that. Hope that some folks can make it down there. And then next year we have 3 new Moots that just got posted for the spring. We have official dates and registration open for Tex Moot. For the UK Moot, we're going back to Europe at last. We haven't been back to Europe since 2019 now, since before the pandemic. So we're finally headed back to Europe. We're going to be doing our UK Moot in York, England this year. So that should be great fun. And then we will be, we'll be headed and then the third one that got posted today is Carolina Moot, going back to North Carolina. So that won't be until the fall of next year, in September. But we're but it's going to be fun to get back to the Southeast. Haven't had one of those since our last Magnolia Moot, which was down in, golly, that was again, that was pre-pandemic too, I believe. So anyway, lots of fun. So those, again, the registrations for those just opened this week, or today. Sorry, this very day as is. Now, the other thing, of course, that I wanted to announce is that this week is the beginning of our fall fundraising campaign. Fall fundraising campaign is an annual tradition at Signum University where I do 2 things. First, to remind folks who haven't had a chance to donate yet that Signum University really has been thriving on the strength of the donations, the generosity of our community. We are a crowd-funded university, unlike very many other universities who tend to raise their money in different ways. The way in which we have been supported by people just giving what they can, making whatever size of tax-deductible donation you can to Signum University has just been a really big help over the years. And of course, the other thing that I like to do, in addition to reminding people that now is the perfect time to begin your donation if you haven't done so yet, the other thing, of course, is to thank everybody who has been donating. It's a wonderful time of year to celebrate the support and generosity of everybody, the hundreds of people who donate to Signum and really make what we do possible. What we do, of course, especially meaning the ability that we have to be able to offer educational opportunities to people for really low prices. We couldn't make ends meet with that if we didn't also have really generous giving to help to supplement and support that. So many thanks to everybody who donates. And as part of the celebration of that season, we're going to be doing giveaways. I'm going to be doing giveaways every week. This has been kind of traditional. We're doing it in a slightly different mechanism this year. For those of you who have listened to other broadcasts I've done this week, you will be prepared for this. But let me explain. For those of you who have not been able to attend either Other Minds and Hands or Exploring the Lord of the Rings this week. So I have prepared a very simple Google form, which just asks for your name and email. You can enter once per week, and I will do a drawing next week during at the beginning of class. I will do a live drawing, and the winner will get a choice of one of 3 prizes. The winner will either get to have a free ticket to a a regional moot of your choice, or the person could choose a month, a flight into a free space class, or you could choose a free anytime audit class. So one of the recordings of one of our grad courses. So you can choose an anytime audit of one of our grad courses, a flight in our space program for a month, or a regional moot of your choice. So those are the three. Those are the three opportunities. And yeah, exactly, Sarah. The reason, so the form to enter your name in the drawing is going to be open all week long, so that people who only get a chance to listen to or watch the class asynchronously are able to participate as well. So don't spam the form now. Only one entry per person per week, though you can enter again next week. No, Jackie, if you have one from last year, it won't have expired. Just send an email to info@signumu.org and we'll get you sorted out there. Yes, so once per week per broadcast, JJ. That's right. Again, if you've attended multiple broadcasts or you're listening to multiple broadcasts, totally fine. There are different links for each one, and you'll see it's got the name of the broadcast on it. So you're very welcome to enter each one that you come across here. And the form, Jocelyn, is right there. There's the link, and I'm going to post it everywhere here. And for people who are listening after the fact, you can find the link to the form in the description of the YouTube recording of this session. So and I'm putting it in the YouTube description because, first of all, it's easy. Even if you don't normally watch or listen on YouTube, you can get there. And it's also up like automatically right away. So anyway, so there you go. I encourage you to fill out the drawing sheet, and I will draw a winner next time. And now, I also wanted to say we're going to do a grand prize drawing too. So at the end of our fall fundraising campaign, which is going to be on Saturday, December 9th, is going to be our webathon when I do my State of the University address and a bunch of other things. During that broadcast on Saturday the 9th, I'm going to do a grand prize drawing for the Mythgard Academy. And that will be, I'll do another drawing of everybody who has filled out the form during the whole month, basically. And the grand prize, the Mythgard Academy grand prize, will be a special one-shot Mythgard Academy class on the text of your choice. So if there's like a short story or a poem that you would like to nominate, you can choose a short story or poem, or you could choose a movie or a TV episode, something we can cover in one session, right? It'll be a special one shot that we will dedicate to the short work, again being short story, poem, movie, or TV episode of your choice. I may exercise some veto, but we may end up discussing it, perhaps, depending on what you choose. But I have never in 10 years actually applied a veto, I think. So, yeah. Anyway, so that's the grand prize that I will be distributing. So you guys will get to choose your own text there. All right. So that is one of the things that we're doing. And again, the point of the drawings and the giveaways, it's just a way of saying thank you to all of you guys for the wonderful support that you are, both in your donations, of course, from so many of you, which, as I say, is really so necessary to help to keep Signum afloat. But even just for your presence as well, which really also, again, both synchronously and asynchronously. Of course, obviously, I rely on the contributions of those of you who can make it synchronously. It would be harder for me to teach if I didn't have anybody attending live. But even those of you who are only listening after the fact are still a big part of this as well. And it's always so good to talk to people and hear from people who have been listening after the fact. All right. So that's what we're doing. And again, if you want to make a donation to help support Signum University, totally tax deductible donation, signumuniversity.org/donate is the place to go. All right, let us get back. I cannot put it off any longer. This is a painful set of chapters, though not nearly as painful as the next chapter that we are that we're gonna that we won't get to this time. We're gonna do chapter 13 and 14 today. Chapter 15, the conclusion, is going to be, it is, Yarrow, it's fascinating, isn't it? This is a really painful book. There is both the emotional sensitivity and honesty of this book. The things that it brings out and exposes are so painful, and yet it is not a book that ever at any point simply like relishes suffering. And I hope you know what I mean by that. I mean, I think that there are many books that do seem to relish suffering, to just sort of grimly enjoy, describing gruesome and palpitating things. But anyway, we will we'll see. Anyway, okay. Yeah. Okay. I'm not gonna even hint about the ending. We'll see where we get. I love this book and where it goes. It does not. I find just sort of, again, stay painful. But let us not leap forward, but continue through here. All right. Last time, in looking at chapter, 12, if I'm remembering my numbers correctly, we were primarily looking at Orual's, not only her first contemplations, and of course that very remarkable scene where she sees the palace in the morning through the cloud, that cloud that was between them that gets lifted for a moment, and then we had conversation between her and Bardia. We were looking at sort of the once again, we were getting the wisdom of Glome, and now we're going to get the wisdom of Greece, right? She is seeking the advice of the two people whom, in chapter 14, Psyche will confess are the two wisest men that she knows in their own ways, right? The fox, of course, for his wisdom, but Bardia as well, for his very different kind of wisdom. And we spent some time looking at that last time, and where Orual was kind of ending up after that. Here is the fox's response to Orual's story. "Alas, alas, poor Psyche," said the fox, "our little child, and how she must have suffered. Hellebor's the right medicine, with rest and peace and loving care. Oh, we'd bring her into frame again, I don't doubt it, if we could nurse her well. But how are we to give her all or any of the things she needs? My wits are dry, daughter. We must think, though, contrive. I wish I were Odysseus, aye, or Hermes." Even before we continue, notice, and this is characteristic of the fox, and even Orual will confess that this is a pattern with him, that he is quick to analyze, he is quick to sort of see to the root of the matter, or at least what looks like the root of the matter from his point of view, right? But what he is not good at is actually making plans. And what he's even worse at is actually implementing plans, right? So here, he noticed that he immediately diagnoses the situation, literally diagnoses, right? He's doing a medical diagnosis of Psyche based on the story. And but then immediately is so he has this does this very quick, almost instantaneous process of analysis and diagnosis and conclusion, and yet his wits are dry. We must think, contrive, and he never gets there. He will never, spoiler for the rest of the chapter, he will never come up, in fact, with a plan. The Odysseus and Hermes reference. Odysseus and Hermes are famous for being clever, for coming up with and executing clever plans. Odysseus is not just somebody that you go to for a good talk. He's not just a philosopher. He's a doer of deeds. He's a person who thinks things through, comes up with cunning plans, and even executes them himself. And Hermes, of course, is the same. He is the god of thieves and tricksters. He's the one who, literally in his infancy, like before he was even a toddler, he stole a herd of cattle and contrived how to conceal their hoof prints so that they couldn't be traced to where he had put them. That's Hermes, right? That's what he does. Anyway, that's so they are Odysseus within the human realm is kind of the paragon of cunning plan makers, and Hermes on the divine level is the sort of archetype of people who come up with sharp and devious schemes for achieving their ends, and that's exactly what the fox is worst at. Anyway, continuing with the passage. You think then she's mad for certain? He darted a quick glance at me. Why, daughter, what then have you been thinking? You'll call it folly, I suppose, but you weren't with her, grandfather. She talked so calmly. There was nothing disordered in her speech. She could laugh merrily. Her glance wasn't wild. If I'd had my eyes shut, I would have believed her palace was as real as this. But your eyes being open, you saw no such thing? You don't think, not possibly, not as a mere 100th chance, there might be things that are real, though we can't see them? Okay. No. Morgul, did Bardia saw Psyche across the river? Yes, he did. They spoke with each other. He didn't see the palace, however. Bardia didn't. Yeah. There was, remember, they saw her, and remember she said to him, this was at the beginning of chapter 11, I think. She said to him, like, I'm sorry, Bardia, you can't come over. And he's like, no, thank you. I don't want to go, right? Yeah, anyway, okay. So on the one hand, the fox is, it's interesting to see Orual's reaction here, because the fox's instantaneous diagnosis is precisely the thing which, when she thought of it, she was clinging to as a kind of lifeline, if you remember. Remember when, not at the beginning of the conversation, but later in the conversation, the idea of her being mad was on the table way at the very beginning of their meeting. But Orual loses sight of it over the course of chapter 11. And it isn't until after she's come close to believing, but then chosen not to, that it suddenly comes back to her as a sort of ally, as a sort of rescue, almost, if you remember that passage late in chapter 11. Madness. Oh, whew. And she's like, I was so glad I thought of that again, right? That is a safe, a comfortable, interpretation, right? Yeah. Oh, good question, Jackie. How old do we think Orual is here? Yeah, I would say early 20s. Remember, we were guessing she was probably 10, 11, something like that, maybe 12. I don't think she's probably still younger than Psyche's mom, but not by very much, right? So I think 12, 13 is probably the upper end of Orual's age when Psyche's born. And then and now Psyche is probably, you know, late teens or something now. So actually, Orual could be between 25 and 30 by now, actually. So she speaks, like a matron talking to her, wedded daughter, right? But though she is significantly older than Psyche, the gap is still less than it would be, right? She still, at the end of the day, is her older sister as well. So yeah, I think probably 25 to 30. Yeah, no, she can't be that much older, Jackie. I mean, again, I can't think Psyche. I'd be shocked if Psyche were 20. That would be, I don't know, shocking. That would be very surprising to me if Psyche were fully 20 years old by the time that this happened. So yeah, and Orual was definitely not. I mean, there is no way Orual cannot possibly be 40. Think about it. Even Redival. Redival's not married yet. Now, Redival probably could have been married younger than this. Remember, there were problems finding a husband for Redival. Redival's the marriageable one because she's pretty, unlike Orual. But the father, the king, wasn't able to marry her off because there weren't any kings. She could only marry into a king's family, and there were no kings who were willing to ally themselves with Glom. And the implication. Remember, there was that one scene when Redival comes to Orual and begs her to convince the king, like that she and the fox should convince the king to find her a husband, right? There's a hint of desperation on Redival's part. I think that Redival is over 20. She's, she might even be as close to an old maid as Charlotte Lucas from Pride and Prejudice. But yeah, so I do think Orual is likely around 30. Redival is probably mid-20s. Still perfectly marriageable. But Redival herself, seems to be starting to get uncomfortable with her unmarried state at that age. And that would seem to me to track to mid-20s. And then Psyche is, again, I think almost certainly under 20. Yeah, Sarah, I don't know that Redival would consider herself an old maid at 18. I mean, goodness knows, she's, as a king's daughter, she's almost certainly marriageable by the time she's 12, right? I mean, if she's menstruated, she's marriageable. So she could very well. I mean, Many is the queen who is married to a king at the age of 12 in European history, and I see no reason to think that would not be the case here. And certainly we have positive reason to think that sort of thing, as it seems very unlikely that Psyche's mom was more than 12 to 14. I think 14 at the highest, basically. Anyway, yeah. Okay. Anyhow, good to kind of lay that out. But coming back, Jackie, to what I think was sort of the thrust of your question, and somebody else was commenting on this too. It is easy to think of Orual as like a, 50-year-old woman, or at least like in her 40s or something, when she's talking to Psyche here. She sounds like that. That's the sort of posture that she adopts, right? But it's not. That's not the case at all. As again, we get little reminders of that when Psyche calls her sister. She alternates between calling her Maya, mommy, literally, and sister. So that's yeah. Again, little sort of reminders. Now, narrator Orual I think narrator Orual is probably over 60. She considers herself an old woman. And you'll sometimes hear people say, like, oh, but people didn't live that long in the ancient world, and so you would be considered an old, like an old man or an old woman by the time you're 40. That is not true. People died younger. That's true. Like, the average life expectancy takes into account all the people, especially babies and children, who die young, right? But again, this was true throughout the Middle Ages, to which I can speak better than I can the ancient world. They would consider like a 60, 70, 80-year-old person old. So if you're talking about, to use the Latin term, a senex, right, an old man, you're generally describing somebody who's like 65 to 80 years old. Now, there are fewer of them running around. Well, barely few of them running around. Few of them walking carefully around in the Middle Ages than there are now in the modern world. That's where the age discrepancy goes. But it is certainly not true that just say like, oh yes, in the ancient world the life expectancy was only 30. That does not mean a 30-year-old would have been considered ancient by any means. But exactly, JJ, that's exactly it. Although people died more often of sickness or of other things, they still knew that it was an early death, not a death of old age. Yes, they did know the difference between dying of sickness, dying of accident, and dying of old age. And they knew that people didn't die of old age until, they were significantly older. Anyway, or war. Yeah, exactly. There's all kinds of things. And yes, high infant mortality, Catriona, skews the average severely. Absolutely. Anyway, okay. Back to Orual here in this passage. I'm not going to get through my weekly 17 slides at this rate. The point I was making was, the fox begins from the point of view, like with the exact balm that she was clinging to herself 2 chapters ago, late in her conversation with Psyche. Madness is a safe explanation, is a comfortable explanation. Madness is an explanation that prevents Orual from having to come face to face with the very uncomfortable possibility that Psyche is telling the truth. And when she found herself being convinced, or at least convinced to consider seriously, Psyche's words, that was when she clung to the idea of her madness, because that's a way to reconcile Psyche's words with the truth that she hopes is true, right? Or with like the idea that she is investing herself in, namely that Psyche's palace is in fact not real and the god is not real. And yet, you'd think, given that fact of what we saw there in chapter 11, when the first thing out of the fox's mouth after the story is like, well, open and shut case of madness, right? I wish we could get her and take care of her and give her some hellebore and nurse her through this, right? You'd think that this would be the greatest relief to Orual, right? That she would just be melting in, sorry, a large insect just fell from the ceiling of my room right in front of me. That was a little bit alarming. But it's just a stink bug from outside. Nothing too scary. Startling, however. Anyway, okay. Again, you would think that she would be absolutely melting in relief to hear the fox's affirmation of her favorite interpretation of what was going on, right? And yet, notice that her reaction is quite the contrary, right? When she hears the fox saying, "Oh, it's obviously madness," she pushes back against that. You think she's mad for certain? You're positive of that? And then notice the fox is like, "What then have you been thinking?" And then she starts in confessional mode, right? If I'd had my eyes shut, I would have believed her palace was as real as this. Or rather, it's not even a confession so much as she is here admitting to the evidence against this interpretation, right? She knew at the time that the madness interpretation was weak, because Psyche was not acting like a crazy person. So she comes out with this. She brings forth with thoroughness all of the counter arguments against the madness interpretation. So again, it's interesting. She doesn't close her eyes to it. And she even pushes it so far as to, well, not very vulnerably. I was going to say make herself very vulnerable. Make herself a little bit vulnerable, anyway. To admit to the fox that she has entertained the idea. She's quietly, cautiously, carefully saying, "But, grandfather, what if it's true? It's not possible? Are you telling me it is completely impossible that it's true?" And notice how careful she has to be about this. "You'll call it folly, I suppose," she says. And then look at all of her qualifications. You don't think, not possibly, not as a mere 100th chance, there might be things that are real, though we can't see them? Could there be divine realities that our eyes don't have access to? And the fox's response, I didn't quote the fox's full response, but he starts talking about, of course there are things that are real that we can't see them, right? He starts listing things like musical notes, virtue, right? Things, those are real things even though we can't see them. And she's like, no, not that kind of thing, right? And then he's like, "What are you thinking?" Right? Again, following up on that, like, "Why, daughter, what then have you been thinking?" line, right? It is interesting, Jackrabbit, the fact that he does not, the fox that is, does not take her questions in the direction of thinking about, like, the ideal forms of things that are invisible to our sight compared to the shadow reality that we see here below us. I think if we needed proof that the fox is not really a Platonist, I think this is it. Right. A Platonist, I think, would know exactly how to respond to these questions. The fox is a more like a Stoic, not a Platonist. Remember, the only time we've gotten what sounded like references to Platonism were in that paragraph where Orual says the fox has said that there are other masters other than the ones that he follows who say this other thing, and that seemed to be. And there have been times when, especially in Psyche's talk about, like, her desires for unseen things and stuff, where she sounded like she has taken on board a little bit of Platonism through the fox. So there seems to be a kind of a coloring of Platonism in some of the fox's philosophy, and at the very least a kind of familiarity that he has passed on, that familiarity to his pupils. But the fox is clearly not, in his at his core a Platonist, I think. Yeah. Yeah, and JJ, you're absolutely right. It's interesting that she pushes back and protests, but still withholds the biggest evidence for her, which was the fact that she actually saw the palace for a bit. Yes. And the fox, of course, will later on, when she keeps pushing in this direction, without even saying, I totally saw the palace too, actually, grandfather. Even without admitting that, she still comes to a point where the fox says, I'm beginning to think that if we do get some of that hellebore, the first dose should be for you. Right. And he says it very gently, right? In the kind of chiding, teasing way he has when he's getting into teacher mode again with her. So yes, she does not admit that. She won't go there, right? And one of the things that I think that we can see from the very beginning of this conversation, both from Orual's hesitancy to fully explain what she feels to be her dilemma. Remember, she's like, it's a riddle, it's a puzzle, I don't know what to do, I don't know how to understand things, right? That's been her whole premise for these whole 2 chapters here, both 12 and 13. This is no riddle to the fox, right? To the fox, this is obvious what's going on here, right? Or there might be a couple possible solutions, but I mean, there aren't that many possible explanations for what's going on with Psyche as far as the fox is concerned. And that's because, as we can see, as he keeps pushing back against her, right? He won't even admit the possibility of an unseen reality, right? Of the reality, frankly, of any of the mysteries. Think about the mysteries of Ungit, right? Thinking back to the conversation with the priest, with the priest of Ungit. The fox is compassionate and loving, but quite closed-minded about these things. And yes, Maury and I agree. Orual is not without fear that she herself has gone mad. I don't think she seriously doubts herself. That doesn't seem to be an idea that she really gives a lot of oxygen to during these. It kind of comes up, but I don't think that that's a primary sort of emphasis for her. Exactly, JJ. I think she's more afraid that it could be true. Yes. Leaf of Starlight, yes. In her core, she definitely knows that she saw the palace. We saw her immediately trying to rationalize that. It's another puzzle. Did I really see it or did I not see it? When you ask the gods to communicate clearly, when you ask for a clear sign, right? I don't know whether to believe Psyche or not. I need a clear sign so that I can know for sure whether or not to believe her. And then you see the palace, you see that it's true. You're given a glimpse of it. There you go, right? And now what? You want another sign to know that that sign was a true sign, right? It speaks pretty clearly to the resistance of Orual's will to this. Personally, I don't think her case against the gods is going very well. At least not, I think, in that incident. And though, yes, First Fish, that's exactly her questions, right? Did she see what she wanted to see? Did she just like trick herself into seeing the palace? Though remember that she immediately says, I could not have imagined that. Like, what I saw was something, bizarre and unusual and unexpected beyond anything I could have imagined from my own experience. But then in addition, the question, did the gods send a sight to trick her? Yes. But again, even that question, maybe it was a fake seeing just to mess with me. That's a question which already presumes on a certain conclusion about the gods and their motivations, right? Yeah. Anyway, and Yarrow, that is, of course, an excellent question. If she wasn't so afraid of losing Psyche, would she be this resistant to believing that she saw the palace? No, I do not think so, right? And again, we saw all of these things all tangled up together in chapter 11. Both her resistance, her sort of general resistance to divine things, but also the sense of competition, right? That gap that's opening between her and Psyche, that sense of them being in two different worlds, and she's losing Psyche, right? And she wants Psyche, and she wants Psyche to herself, right? Yes, she wants to keep Psyche on her own terms, Cal Elros, exactly so. Anyway, let's keep going. Hey, 2 slides in an hour. Oh, grandfather, I don't mean things like that, like musical notes and virtue and things like that. If there are souls, could there not be soul houses? He ran his hands through his hair with an old familiar gesture of teacher's dismay. Child, he said, you make me believe that after all these years you have never even begun to understand what the word soul means. Love this. You get the wordplay here, right? Because I don't think that the fox himself does. What is, they're speaking in Greek. What's the word soul in Greek? Psyche. Exactly. What the fox has literally just said is, you make me believe that after all these years you have never even begun to understand what the word psyche means. This is one of those moments. It's a short moment. This is, for Lewis, this is an extremely small waving of a flag. That is waving of a flag to remind you, to encourage you to think allegorically. Lewis loves allegory. Footnote, because I always have to say this, the Chronicles of Narnia are not allegory. It's a different kind of thing that he's doing in the Chronicles of Narnia. It's not allegory. But he does love allegory, both as a reader and as a writer. He loves allegory. And this is the kind of allegory that he's doing here. And it is a very deep kind of allegory because it's an allegory that's meant to be read on multiple levels at the same time. Psyche is not merely a symbol. She is not merely an embodiment of the human soul. But she is an embodiment of the human soul also, right? Her story, the story of Psyche and Orual and Redival and the fox, this is a story on its own terms, right? And we need to remember, we cannot, if we just start abstracting, right? Think about the conversation we were just having before about the ages of Orual and Psyche. If we're not thinking about those characters in these terms, the story absolutely encourages us to think about these characters in those terms. It absolutely encourages us to remember, to think about these people as people, and to think about their sort of function and relationship within this story in these terms. But there is also this symbolic overlay, right? Because of her name, Psyche, which means soul. Psyche's adventure here, Psyche's encounter with the divine, takes on this larger allegorical resonance at the same time. That this is the story of Psyche and Orual and what happened with them, but this is also a kind of embodiment of, in principle, the encounter between the human soul and the divine. And remember, that was exactly what that was the primary focus of Psyche's own story when she told it. Remember how that's what she kept emphasizing, all of these the feelings and reactions that she had as a mortal coming into contact with the divine, right? She is a dramatization, an exploration of what it looks like or can look like when a human soul comes in contact with the divine. That symbolic allegorical resonance is real with Psyche, a crucial element of her character. But despite the fact that her name is basically human soul, right, we can forget that. This passage helps us to remember it. You have to know some Greek, right? If you don't know the Greek and you're not thinking about it in those terms, you might miss this, right? That's a little unusual for Lewis. C.S. Lewis was first and foremost, my own assessment of him, he is first and foremost a teacher. He is as Tolkien is at his heart a poet and a painter, Lewis is at his heart a teacher. And, but this makes Tolkien very much more willing than Lewis to run the risk that readers won't get the point. Lewis is not as willing to run that risk that readers won't get the point. This is what makes Lewis so a much, much better writer of nonfiction. On Fairy Stories is a genius essay. It would be about 25 times as effective if Lewis had written it. It's just, Tolkien was not a great nonfiction writer. He just didn't think that way. It wasn't how he was wired. Anyway, now I've often, of course, people often, Arthur, say that the Chronicles of Narnia are not subtle. Who promised they would be? Did anyone suggest that they ought to be? It's a quite clear and plain premise. There's nothing wrong with that. That's quite traditional, actually. There's this sense. I have no beef with anybody who doesn't like that. But I often hear people, and Arthur, I'm not accusing you of this, but I've often heard people talk about that with this sense of like like betrayal almost, right? Like it's not the done thing, to do that kind of thing. And I like, you don't have to like it, but there's nothing wrong with, like, there's no rule that says you have to. And again, a lot of this is because a lot of the people that I talk to are Tolkien fans. And so, if Tolkien is your standard, then he will, you will be sort of acculturated in a particular way. And the sort of thing that Lewis is doing in the Chronicles of Narnia will feel very different and in some ways kind of shocking, right? But there's not really. Again, like it's I understand what you say about being in your face, but if someone presents you with a bouquet of flowers, they tend to put them in your face. That's how it works, right? That's the proper way to present some things, right? Anyway, it's as I say, I'm not suggesting there's a right or wrong answer here, but that's my point. Is I don't think there's a right or wrong answer here. That Lewis. Anyway, whatever. Mortal Hamster. I'm not a huge fan of Planet Narnia, but now that's a huge digression, and I'm not gonna even go there. Okay. The word soul, allegory. There we are. Anyway, the point I was making is that this is unlike Lewis does almost. I mean, I can't remember Lewis dropping hints this subtly when he's doing allegory, right? Anyway, okay. All right, let's keep going. Orual has just said the fox would laugh at her if he knew the things that she had been, like the ideas she had been even briefly entertaining, right? I'd be more likely to weep. Oh, child, 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 when shall I have washed the nurse and the grandam and the priest and the soothsayer out of your soul? Do you think the divine nature... Why, it's profane, ridiculous. That is, that the god could marry Psyche, right? He is responding to the idea that there may actually be a god on the mountain who has married and is having sex with Psyche, like that kind of actual literal marriage with Psyche. That's what he is calling profane and ridiculous here. You might as well say the universe itched, or the nature of things sometimes tippled in the wine cellar. I haven't said it was a god, grandfather, said I. I am asking who you think it was. A man, of course, said the fox, beating his hands on the table. What, are you still a child? Didn't you know there were men on the mountain? Men? I gasped. Yes, vagabonds, broken men, outlaws, thieves. Where are your wits? Sarah says, the nature of things tippled in the wine cellar. Enter Terry Pratchett. Yes. The nature of things sometimes tippled in the wine cellar sounds almost like it could almost be a title of a Terry Pratchett book, couldn't it? Yeah. Anyway, are there actually men on the mountain? Curious chance, I see no reason to doubt it. That there are now, well, okay. Curious chance, I have one reason to doubt it. And that is the general sense that it seems that everybody who lives thereabouts has, that's holy ground up there. But remember, there's Glome and there's the river, and then across there's the mountain. Remember, Orual herself she'd never even been outside of the city. She'd never even been other than in the hills on the other side, right? She'd never been up in the mountain before. So there's this sense of it's wilderness. Lions live out there and stuff, right? On the mountain. And so therefore vagabonds, outlaws, thieves, broken men, people who are cast out of society in Gloam may go and live out there in the wilderness on and around the mountain. That doesn't necessarily mean they'd be up in that secret valley of the gods, which Bardia and Graham both seem to have no interest in entering, right? So there is that one reason perhaps to have hesitation in believing this, but that there are men, as the fox suggests, does not seem in any way outlandish. Okay. One thing I would point out. Notice that the fox is inconsistent. There are several. The inconsistencies of the fox are, of course, generally charming, right? Including, of course, an inconsistency which Orual herself does not think of or point to in the conversation they were just having, right? Namely, that he will say things like this, that it's profane, ridiculous to say these things about the divine nature. And yet he loves the story of Aphrodite and Anchises, which is quite exactly the same as what is going on with Psyche, right? So he loves those stories. He is swept away by those stories when he recites the poetry. And he has taught, he has tried to train Orual and Psyche as well as he can in the wisdom of his Greek masters. And yet he has also taught them all of the myths and poetry as well, right? They know the story of, Agamemnon and Iphigenia, the daughter whom he sacrifices. They, he doesn't have to explain who Odysseus and Hermes are, right? She knows. So the fact that he himself, so the question that the fox never seems to ask is, why does he love those stories so much? What is it that sweeps him away? What is it that speaks to his soul about the story of, what is it about the story of Aphrodite and Anchises, right, that speaks to his soul, even though he then denies it, right? Now, he might characterize this as his own weakness, right? He's well aware of the fact that he still has much further to go in the, in the path of wisdom. But still, again, those inconsistencies, but that's not where Orual goes. She doesn't lean into that. But notice that he's also being logically inconsistent here. There are two very firm theories, right? That he comes first, his diagnosis. She's obviously insane, right? She's obviously gone mad, and we can hope to treat her, right? And now he considers it equally obvious that the theory about the madness is that none of this stuff is actually happening to her, right? She's living in a delusion brought on by her madness. And the second is that she is being deceived by an outlaw, by a man. They're not absolutely contradictory logically. You could say that she has gone mad and her madness is being capitalized on by the outlaw or thief. But it still seems to me to invite the question, he's willing to go a certain way. His initial diagnosis of madness and the conversation that came after it seem to imply there is no reality to anything she's saying. She says she's living in a palace. She says she has a husband. She says all of these things, right? None of it's true. She's insane, right? But then, oh wait, actually, maybe the husband part is true, not what she thinks, right? But maybe there's some truth to that. And it suggests other things too. Why, if there's no house that she's living in, why does she not show more evidence of exposure? Because she seems, in fact, to be living in that valley, and not in the house of a thief or outlaw that she has merely mistaken for a palace, right? How would that be explained? Anyway, so there are the ideas that he throws out here don't entirely hold together, but both of them are stated by him with extreme confidence. "Where are your wits?" he says to her. Of course, he says, right? This is the language that he uses with her. "For the second time that day, I was utterly aghast. The fox's explanation seemed too plain and evident to allow me any hope of doubt. While Bardia was speaking, his had seemed the same." Remember, Bardia was suggesting that it's a hideous brute, which is why he doesn't want her to look at him, right? That she is the bride of the brute is Bardia's explanation. That she is the, deceived whore of a thief and outlaw is the fox's explanation. "It looks, grandfather," said I dully, "as if you had read the riddle right." "It needed no Oedipus, but the real riddle's still to guess. What must we do? Oh, I'm barren. I think your father has addled my brains with beating me about the ears. There must be some way, yet we've so little time." Oedipus, of course, as we call him in America, is famous for being a riddle solver. He doesn't have the reputation of Odysseus of being the cunning contriver of plans, but he is the solver of riddles, right? That's what he is famous for, which is why he says this. In England, they pronounce the OE vowel in Greek as a long E. Oedipus is how most English people will say that name. So I always say it that way in my head because of the rhyme. It's a great sentence. "It needed no Oedipus." It's a favorite expression. It's an azimuth thingy. Is it? Curious Chance. Anyway. It's a favorite expression of mine, though I don't get to use it very often because most people won't get it. Not that they've never heard of Oedipus, but just most people don't get the "till we have faces" reference. But yes, when you say things, give an interpretation, and somebody says, "Oh, I think you're right about that," you say, "Oh, it needed no Oedipus." Anyway, love that phrase. Anyway, so okay. Once again, he comes back to his barrenness. Once again, we see the fox's wisdom as applied to the situation is ultimately barren. It provides no remedy, which is ironic given that his whole starting point, was a diagnosis, a treatment plan, right? Let's get some hellebore. We can take her. We can nurse her. We'll set her to rights in no time, right? And yet he can't. He's barren. His wisdom bears no children. But also at the same time, he is totally confident in his interpretation, right? It needed no Oedipus. This was an easy riddle to solve, right? It's not hard. When he goes on, the fox goes on to think it through a little bit more, this whole mountainy man theory of his, and to explain how this could have come about, that he, will have deceived her and have, seduced her, and, has convinced her that he's the god coming to her, and is taking advantage of her gullibility and delusion to sleep with her in the dark, right? As the fox rather bluntly walks through all that, right? Orual does not take it. Yes, and he's sure that Psyche's likely to be pregnant soon. Yes. And that's what sets her off here specifically, right? Yeah. It was as if I'd been hit about the heart. Leprosy and scabs on the man, I gasped. Curse him, curse him. Psyche to carry a beggar's brat? We'll have him impaled if ever we catch him. He shall die for days. Oh, I could tear his body with my bare teeth. You darken our counsels and your own soul with these passions, said the fox. If there were anywhere she could lie hidden, if we could get her. Yeah, really looking like her dad in this scene, right? Remember that Psyche's comment that she looked exactly like their father when she was angry. Yes. Remember the significance of how she is not only darkening their counsels by her passions, but she's darkening her own soul. This is part of the fundamental philosophy, the very Boethian philosophy, or rather Boethius was following these same philosophies, that when you do evil, when you give rein to your darker passions like this, you are doing damage to yourself even more than you're doing harm to other people. If you're indulging in these passions of anger and revenge and this desire for violence, you will do harm to someone else, but if you act them out, but even just in indulging them the way that she's doing harm to her own soul. Yeah. Well, Mighty Felix, the fox does believe in the soul. Remember, he talks about it in a different way, right? It's it is the God within us all. Remember how he's always talking about how, there is the God within us all. We're all, that's why everybody in the Fox's philosophy, everybody are brothers, right? All people are equal because all people have the God within them, the God within me and the God within you is sort of the way he talks, right? So he believes in the soul. But ironically, though I don't think that's his vocabulary exactly, right? I think that's what he's talking about when he talks about the God within us, right? He talks about the divine nature, and we all have the divine nature within us as well, right? Which Orual is damaging, right, by giving way to her passions like this. Anyway, one of the conclusions here, I think, is that if we think back to Psyche's story about her experience of being a mortal encountering the divine, it's not the divine that the fox doesn't believe in. In a sense, it's the mortality that he doesn't believe in. Do you see what I mean by that? There's the divine in all of them. It can get clouded. In some, it's thoroughly choked, like a garden overrun with weeds, like the king. The king would be a good example. But he believes that everybody has and everybody is born with that divine essence within them. So he's not on board with the idea of a marriage between the human and the divine, anything like Psyche's marriage, right? Not only because it's impious blasphemy to imagine something like a god taking on mortal form and actually having sex with a human woman, which is what Psyche is claiming is happening, right? I mean, that's why he's making the comparison of saying, like, the nature of things tippled in the wine cellar, right? It's just as ridiculous and impious to say that. But yeah, Kalros, if everything is divine, then is anything divine? Yeah. Remember who else has that reaction? The king, right? When the fox says that all, there's divine blood in everyone, right? There's the God in everybody. All humans are equal. The king is like, well, I hope not, right? He doesn't want to believe that. Because it's exactly it, right? If everything is divine, then is anything divine? There's nothing special about the king's house if everybody has the God within them. But similarly, there can be no encounter between the human and the divine if everybody is divine. Yes, and Leaf of Starlight, I do think that what you just said there is the logical extension of that. Everything is soul, in a sense, but the world is not enchanted in the way the people of Gloam believe. Yes. That is, I think, the heart of the beliefs of Gloam, that they live in the mortal world, and that the divine world is there and the human world is there, and they're usually separate, but that the divine world keeps intruding. And there are places that are enchanted. There are places that are haunted with the presence of the divine, like the House of Ungit, like the Ungit statue, like the priest, especially when he has the bird mask on, right? Like the marriage bed, all kinds of places where the divine and the human can interact with each other at times, right? But that's not a real comfortable thing. And remember Bardia's really important statement of his description of how he tries to exercise a, live and let live policy with the gods and just not draw their attention, right? Yeah. Okay, let's keep going. At last I said, "It all comes to this, grandfather. I must go back to Psyche. I must overrule her somehow. Once she is on our side, once she knows her shame and danger, then the three of us must devise as best we can. It may be that she and I must go out into the wide world together, wander like Oedipus." "And I with you," said the fox. "Once you bade me run away. This time I'll do it." "One thing certain," said I, "she shall not be left to the felon who has abused her. I will choose any way rather than that. It rests on me. Her mother's dead. What mother but me has she ever known? Her father's nothing for a father, and nothing for a king either. The honor of our house, the very being of Psyche, only I am left to care for them. She shall not be left. I'll... What, child? You are pale. Are you fainting? If there's no other way, I will kill her." Whew. All right. Let me just continue because I kept going here. "Bye-bye," said the fox, so loud that Pooby, that is the Orual's maid, stopped her game and stared at him. Daughter, daughter, you are transported beyond all reason and nature. Do you know what it is? There's 1 part love in your heart, and 5 parts anger, and 7 parts pride. The gods know I love Psyche too, and you know it, and you know I love her as well as you do. It's a bitter grief that our child, our very Artemis and Aphrodite all in one, should live a beggar's life and lie in a beggar's arms. Yet even this, it is not to be named beside such detested impieties as you speak of. Why, look at it squarely, as reason and nature have made it, not as passion would paint it. To be poor and in hardship, to be a poor man's wife. Wife? You mean his trull, his drab, his whore, his slut. Nature knows nothing of these names. What you call marriage is by law and custom, not nature. Nature's marriage is but the union of the man who persuades with the woman who consents, and so the man who persuades, or more likely forces or deceives, being some murderer, alien, traitor, runaway slave, or other filth. Which you'll remember the fox is like, on the slave subject, right? I am a slave, and we just talked about me running away. So you and I don't kind of look at that exactly the same way. Yeah. Okay. Notice Orual's progression here, right? I must go back to Psyche. I must overrule her somehow. I need to convince her. I need to compel her. To overrule her, right? Just to, not to persuade, but to overrule. To make her know her shame and danger. And then when she's on our side, the 3 of us can contrive. We will do something. And what she suggests is to go out in the wide world together, to wander like Oedipus. Oedipus sets off as a blind beggar at the end of Oedipus Tyrannus. Sorry, spoilers, if you don't know how Oedipus ends. She's going to wander like Oedipus. And the fox immediately jumps in, and I with you. This time I will run away. This is on both of their parts a significant act of self-sacrifice. They will give up. I mean, Orual is still the daughter of a king, right? Her future is uncertain, it's true. But still, she has never known anything but relative comfort, right? She certainly has never been wandering as a beggar woman around the world. She's willing to lose all of everything that she's ever known except for Psyche, right? She would choose Psyche over all of those things. That's good, right? That's but then, and the fox is all about it, right? Completely down with her on that point. But then there's the shift. She shall not be left to the felon who has abused her. I will choose any way rather than that. She would rather kill Psyche herself than leave her the wife or whore of a murderer or felon or runaway slave. Yes, JJ, it is interesting that her thought goes to killing Psyche rather than killing the outlaw. Absolutely. Absolutely. And yes, Emily, this is where finally that tendency that we've seen in Orual already has finally come to the surface, that if I can't have her, then nobody can. Strain of her love for Psyche. Yes. Now, Judy, I agree with you that she believes Psyche is in a cult-like situation which demands an intervention. Yes. That's why I think she's using the word overrule. Of course, she's not just like a random friend or well-wisher who is, intervening in a case like a cult-like situation, as you say, Judy. But also, she's her mom, functionally her mom, right? Yeah. I think it's very clear, Cal Elros, that killing, it's good to ask the question, is killing like this itself wrong in Gloam? Not the fox's reactions, right? But in Gloam itself. Yes. Notice her own, even the way they keep throwing around the word murderer here shows the sort of direction of that, the place of that in this society, I think. Agreed, Alyssa. I was thinking of the king killing the cupbearer as well. It's the king at his most savage. Notice even the king has like an almost psychotic break there, right? Like he doesn't remember. He's like, who did this, when he sees the body of the serving boy. So I mean, is killing somebody as unthinkable in Gloam as it may be in our society? Certainly not. I mean, heck, they do human sacrifice, right? That's a thing in Gloam. So there's that. But is murder still very definitely not only illegal, but immoral? Absolutely. And again, because murderers keep getting brought up as a rather extreme example of horrible people, as even in this case. Okay. Back to the fox's reaction. The idea of her killing... Oh, wait, hang on. Oh, sorry, one last thing I wanted to make sure I didn't miss. Notice her... sorry. There we go. Notice her reactions, right? The trend that she goes. Her mother's dead, her father's nothing. The honor of our house, the very being of Psyche, only I am left to care for them. The honor of our house, not a factor that the fox is on board with. This is, though, this keeps coming out of Orual, though. It's not only for Psyche's sake. It's like the shame of someone of divine lineage, divine royal lineage, being joined. It's not until the idea that Psyche might actually be pregnant by this thief and outlaw that this scum, lowest of the low among the human hierarchy, would not only sleep with but beget a child on Psyche, the glorious daughter of kings, right? That bothers Orual tremendously. Now, Leaf of Starlight, I absolutely do not deny that it also is a convenient thing to be morally outraged about, to cover her personal feeling around Psyche, but I don't think she's covering it. Yes, to some extent, yes. Like, is it convenient? It's absolutely convenient. But it does. She goes there a lot. She brings it up a lot. I think it's clearly a factor for her, especially since it's especially conspicuous because the fox himself is always trying to. That's one of the things he's trying to wash out of her. He has for years, right? The nurse and the grandam and the priest and the soothsayer, right? All of these traditional superstitious beliefs. And one that he explicitly contradicts on multiple occasions is this idea of the divine blood of their house. But Orual keeps coming back to it and bringing it up again and again. And before this point, this was true back even before Psyche was sacrificed. Yes, I agree, Dolores Stroke. her entire being and instinct is contrary, Orual's, to the fox's teaching, and yet she respects him so much. Yeah, exactly. And Dolorous Stroke, what we get then in the fox's reaction is an illustration of that departure, right? Of Orual's like being and convictions and the fox's philosophy, which she respects as much as she does, right? The fox was like, yeah, it's horrible, and he hates to think of this this man, right? This vagabond who has seduced, deceived, deflowered Psyche. But notice when he considers it in the light of reason, as he puts it, right? When you step back and think about it without the passions, Orual's passionate, violent response, her threat to murder Psyche in order to stop this horrible thing from happening, is what brings out the fox's reason. He was giving way to his own passions before, right? Oh, my Psyche, right? He gets more and more logical and rational in response to Orual's passions. The gods know I love Psyche too, and you know it. It's a bitter grief that our child should live a beggar's life and lie in a beggar's arms. Yet even this is not to be named beside such detested impieties as you speak of. Orual has just said, I would rather kill her with my own hands than see her in the arms of a beggar. And he's like, whoa, hang on. For her to live a beggar's life and to lie in a beggar's arms, that is a bitter grief. But that is way better than her being murdered. Right? Why? Look at it squarely, as reason and nature have made it. To be poor and in hardship, to be a poor man's wife, you know what she knows, Orual knows what he's going to go on to say, right? Where's that sentence going? To be poor and in hardship, to be a poor man's wife, these are not evils, right? They are only evil if you make them evil. A poor person who experiences hardship, right? A woman who is the wife of a poor man, has the God in her, right? Is by her own choices to be able to live a life of enlightenment, right? There's nothing intrinsically evil about poverty or hardship. That's where he's headed, right? Yes, it's a bitter grief to us to imagine Psyche living this life, but it's not evil itself. And this makes Orual even more angry, right? She won't even hear her called, Psyche called, the beggar's wife, his trull, his drab, his whore, his slut. Nature knows nothing of these names, chastises the fox. Nature's marriage is but the union of the man who persuades and the woman who consents. Yeah. She won't hear it. She won't hear it. The fox still can't come up with a plan. So he's tired. He's gonna sleep on it. Right. And Orual is disgusted. Mary, that line about the man who persuades and the woman who consents is going in your vows for sure. Yeah. That's not the way most of them are framed, it's true. Not real romantic in modern terms. Yeah, Dolorous Stroke, that's exactly it. Nature, the nature of things, is completely rational, according to the fox. Yeah, absolutely. Orual is left alone. Everyone goes from me, I said. None of them cares for Psyche. She lives at the very outskirts of their thoughts. She is less to them, far less, than Pubi is to me. They think of her a little, and then get tired, and go to something else, the fox to his sleep, and Bardia to his dull or scold of a wife. You are alone, Orual. Whatever is to be done, you must devise and do it. No help will come. All gods and mortals have drawn away from you. You must guess the riddle. Not a word will come to you until you have guessed wrong, and they all come crowding back to accuse and mock and punish you for it. I sent Pubi to bed. Then I did a thing which I think few have done. I spoke to the gods myself, alone, in such words as came to me, not in a temple and without a sacrifice. I stretched myself face downward on the floor and called upon them with my whole heart. I took back every word I had said against them. I promised anything they might ask of me, if only they would send me a sign. They gave me none. When I began, there was red firelight in the room and rain on the roof. When I rose up again, the fire had sunk a little lower, and the rain drummed on as before. Yes, the problem, Leaf of Starlight, is exactly as Yarrow says. They've already sent you several signs. Exactly. If they would just send me a sign. This other time I'm asking, right? They gave me none, no sign. This is another moment that's really historically, culturally cool, right? The idea of praying, of speaking to God or to the gods in such words as come to you, not in a temple and without a sacrifice, doesn't seem so strange from a modern perspective. Was indeed unheard of in the ancient world. Not a thing that people did. It's not just that they didn't think of it. It's inappropriate to come to the gods, to initiate. I was talking about the ways in which the divine world contacts the human world in different places in Gloam. That's clearly the culture, right? For a human to initiate that contact, gutsy. That's gutsy. You don't just do it. Remember Bardia, right? Bardia does everything he can to keep the god's attention away from him, right? To just talk to the gods. Yo, hey gods, over here. Come here. I want to talk to you, right? You don't do that. You really don't do that. You can't do that because there are only certain mechanisms by which the connection between the divine and the human can be established. Temples, sacrifices. That's part of the thing. I mean, yeah. This is something I think it's even easy to miss in the Bible, in particular in the Hebrew Bible. I think that Christians especially tend to not see the significance of the temple in the Hebrew Bible. It's a big deal, the temple. So anyway, yes, this is extremely countercultural, what Orual is doing here. And it's this fascinating but horribly ironic moment, isn't it? Where on the one hand, she is doing a thing which seems like just the right kind of thing to do. Remember her perception of her and Psyche being in different worlds, right? And drifting apart from each other. Psyche had crossed the boundary, like that stream, right? She had crossed the boundary and entered into the land of the gods, and Orual was standing in the human world, and she couldn't reach her, right? Orual is here reaching out to, calling out to that other world. There is a communication across the divide that Orual is herself attempting to initiate here. That's very different than we've seen Orual do. Very different from Orual's approach and active choices that she has made to this point. And yet, she doesn't really seem open to the response. She is saying, send me a sign, when they've already sent her a sign 3 times, including at least one, the first one, which came to her like words spoken. Such words as came to me. That's exactly what happened. Words came to her as she was going up the mountain. Why should my heart not dance? That's exactly what happened. Almost the words in which she described the experience. That words came to her in her heart. But every time she has seen a sign, that first one, going up the mountain, why should my heart not dance? Psyche's appearance, and immediately echoing that, why should our hearts not dance? And the vision, the view of the palace that she was given in the morning. All 3 of those have not only been signs, they've been pretty clear signs of exactly the kind that she is calling for. And but she, every time, immediately and resolutely set herself to reject it, to dismiss it, to make it go away, convince herself that it didn't happen, or even was wrong, was bad. And so it seems no great wonder that she's not given a 4th sign here. Curious Chance, I agree that the way that last sentence begins, when I began there was red firelight in the room and rain on the roof, that leads us perhaps to expect when I rose up again, the fire was out and, the skies were clear, something to indicate a significant passage of time, right? That's what it seems set up for, but that doesn't seem in fact to be what she's saying at all. I don't know how much time passed. Presumably not hours, because the fire probably would have gone out, because Pooby's not there to feed it, and she's not been feeding the fire, so within a few hours the fire probably would have gone out. And so it hasn't, so it probably has not been hours. But I don't think that this is about the passage of time. What she's doing is emphasizing how nothing has changed, how no kind of sign has been given at all from the gods. Yeah, exactly, Mighty Felix, emphasizing the lack of a sign. That's exactly it. My mind was much clearer. I now saw that I had, strangely, taken both Bardia's explanation and the fox's, each while it lasted, for certain truth. Yet one must be false, and I could not find out which, for each was well rooted in its own soil. If the things believed in Glome were true, then what Bardia said stood. If the fox's philosophy were true, what the fox said stood. But I could not find out whether the doctrines of Glome or the wisdom of Greece were right. I was the child of Glome and the pupil of the fox. I saw that for years my life had been lived in 2 halves, never fitted together. We have noticed this before, right? Orual is just seeing it now. We saw it a little while before, right? She is there in the middle, trying to judge these 2 things. These 2 chapters, chapter 12 and 13, really dramatize that division, right? Really dramatize those two worlds that she is standing between, that she is sitting in judgment between. As we've seen, parallel to the position of the king, right? I am neither priest nor Greekling. She has a much more constructive relationship with both halves than the king does. But there she is. I could not find out whether the doctrines of Glome or the wisdom of Greece were right. Now remember, we have seen this done. She's there saying one of these has to be right and the other has to be. They can't both be true. They're contradictory to each other, which is true. So they can't both be true. So her question is, one of them has to be right and one of them has to be wrong. But we've seen somebody do this differently. We have seen one example of somebody who took the wisdom of Greece and the wisdom of Glome and saw that both of them were partial understandings of another thing. That there is a sense in which, not in which neither of them is true, but in which both of them are true. That both of them have part of the truth. And if you can put them both together, if you can see beyond both of them, you can begin to see how both of them are pointing at the truth. And of course, that was Psyche. That was Psyche the night before her sacrifice. And then even more strongly in chapter 11, when they met again afterwards. We can see most explicitly in the earlier chapter, chapter 9, when they, that night before her sacrifice in the room with 5 sides, we saw Psyche understanding, getting more out of the fox's philosophy than the fox gets. We saw her getting more from the wisdom of Glome than the priest or Bardia get in their different ways. And we saw her in chapter 11 beginning to encounter in a simple, straightforward, personal, tactile way the mystery, the truth that lay behind both of them. But that's not where Orual is, right? That she had lived her life in 2 halves never fitted together seems clear. But the kind of rigid thinking that she is showing here, one or the other must be true, which is it, right, is very different from Psyche's response. Suddenly there rose up before me the memory of Psyche in the mountain valley, bright face, brimming over with joy. My terrible temptation came back, to leave her to that fool-happy dream, whatever came of it, to spare her, not to bring her down from it into misery. Must I be to her an avenging fury, not a gentle mother? And part of my mind now was saying, do not meddle. Anything might be true. You are among marvels that you do not understand. Carefully, carefully. Who knows what ruin you might pull down on her head and yours? But with the other part of me, I answered that I was indeed her mother and her father too, all she had of either. That my love must be grave and provident, not slipshod and indulgent. That there is a time for love to be stern. After all, what was she but a child? If the present case were beyond my understanding, how much more must it be beyond hers? Children must obey. It had hurt me long ago when I made the barber pull out the thorn. Had I not, none the less, done well? I hardened my resolution. I knew now which of 2 things I must do, and no later than on the day which would soon be breaking. Alyssa agreed. There rose up before me. Rose up, I don't know, maybe like a sign, right? Yeah, exactly. So wait a second. you ask the gods for an answer to the question, and then all of a sudden there rises up before you, right, the memory of Psyche. And this impulse that you have a hard time explaining comes upon you. And you hear part of your mind, right? You hear part of your mind saying these things as if you're hearing them in words. Do not meddle. Anything might be true. You are among marvels that you do not understand. Carefully, carefully. Who knows what ruin you might pull down on her head and yours. It's almost like that might be the God's answer to her prayers. But the other part of her has the answer. Love must be grave and provident. She is her mother and her father. Children must obey. What was she but a child? Right, JJ says, it can't be the answer to her prayers. It's not what she wanted to hear. Yes, exactly. Leaf of Starlight, I too wonder what Orual expects a communication from the gods to be like. On the one hand, Orual could, of course, very easily be forgiven if she has some rather narrow expectations. When Ungit sends a sign, right, she does so in certain ways, right? Generally, that those signs or the meaning of those signs are revealed by the priests. That's their job. That's what they're for, right? But she has just been breaking that template herself, right? She was just admitting, I did a thing that nobody else has done. She thinks she might be unique in the world's history. That's how countercultural it is in her experience. I called out to the gods in normal words. I just talked to them. Yeah, what do you expect them to, send a sign in the flight of birds? In the entrails of a sheep, maybe? The gods do send messages that way. Everybody knows that, right? Priests interpret those things. That's well known in this world. Panaro says, Orual is the kind of person who keeps shaking the magic 8-ball for a redo. Yeah, it sounds like it. Okay, so we only got through one chapter again. Not going to apologize. Next time, let us see, ambitiously, if we can get through chapters 14 and 15. Chapter 14, we're going to get the next confrontation. It'll be basically the third conversation between Orual and Psyche. The first in the room with 5 sides, the second in their first meeting across the river and in the valley, and the third, the second meeting, right, up in the Valley of the Gods. So chapters 14 and 15, we'll see if we can get through both of them next. Chapter 15 is relatively short, though devastating. All right. Then we will have come to the turning point of this book. All right. Thanks, everybody. Don't forget, let me resend the link to enter our drawing, our celebratory drawing in our fall fundraising campaign. And remember, for those who are listening asynchronously, this link can be found in the YouTube description of this episode, in the description of the YouTube recording of this episode. So if you listen to this in the podcast stream, go to YouTube and you can find the link there. And We'll do a drawing live in class next time, and we'll see who wins. Awesome. Thanks, everybody, and I'll see you guys next week. Bye now.